George Vecsey, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversation.
My pleasure. Nice to be here.
It's been a long time since we chatted. The last time was about 9 years ago when your Stan Musial book came out.
9 years is nothing. It goes fast, like
Now,
yesterday.
you contributed to the book 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy.
I did indeed.
Unlike most of the other contributors, you were old enough to actually see Jackie Robinson play at one point.
Yes.
So you start off with you went to a game with your son, and you're observing how they play the game today. And two older African American gentlemen were comparing now and then. I said Jackie Robinson wouldn't have made that mistake. So
Right.
talk a little bit about you've met Jackie Robinson on occasion. Tell us about the first time you met him.
Well, the first time I met him was, I think, the last day of the 1954 season. And the reason I know this is the Dodgers are playing the Pittsburgh Pirates, and Carl Spooner pitched one of the two great games he pitched at the end of that year that made everybody think he was going to be Sandy Koufax before Sandy Koufax, which didn't happen for him. But anyway, my friend and I were standing on line at the hot dog stand below home plate in the rotunda, and mid game, and standing right behind us was Jackie Robinson. He had a one of these glossy team jackets on. He was in uniform, but he wasn't playing that day, and it was pretty well known that his knee was hurting him or whatever it was, and he just wasn't going to finish out the season on the field. And we turned and asked him, waiting to buy a hot dog, how the knee was and how did he feel? The things kids would ask a player, not being sassy or nothing controversial. And he was as nice as could be, fatherly, talking to a family. He wanted a hot dog, so I guess he was going to stand in line. But he didn't say, like, I don't talk during games or any of that stuff. So I just had this nice feeling from a 5-minute chat with a guy we admired very much. The next time I spoke to him, as I remember it, I don't think I ever met him again in his last years or even in retirement. But in 1960, I don't know, 5 or 6, I was working for Newsday, and Newsday asked me to do a piece on why have there been no black managers. And so I called, Larry Doby, George Crow, a few other people, and I arranged to call Jackie Robinson at home, and he answered the phone, and I thought it was going to be an easy, comfortable conversation. And I told him what I was doing, what I was looking for. And he said, well, let me ask you a question first. How many black reporters, or whatever word he used, are there on the Newsday sports section? And
Mm.
Newsday was a very progressive, we wrote about race. We were very open about those things. We were ahead of the New York papers. I say we like ball players, they always talk about we, whatever we is at the moment. And, but then I said, well, no, my paper doesn't have any blacks in fact, they just hired their first couple of black reporters, news reporters. And he just went off on it. He said, well, that's what I'm trying to say. That's the problem. It's not just baseball. It's every place. He was very much a jobs guy. This was, now what, almost a decade after his retirement, working for Chock full of nuts and active in politics and pressured to hire more African Americans. And so he really went off for about 5 or 10 cranky minutes that it's a national society problem. It wasn't just baseball, that he didn't want to start talking about baseball. Eventually he did. And I think, as I recall it, I can't even find the story. As I recall it, he talked about the number of people that had come and gone who would have been great managers. I suspect he probably mentioned Doby and George Crow because they would have been. And so it ended. So I never spoke to him again. I did write him a letter when his older son Jackie was killed, died young, and but I didn't hear back. I didn't expect to. And then after he passed, I began to meet Rachel Robinson and his daughter Sharon. So I feel like I've had obviously much more conversations with both of them, and keeping up with Robinson that way.
Yours is probably the only contribution in this book. I mean, most of the people who have contributed essays are in the academic field. You, as a newspaper person, have a
Mhm,
unique perspective. You write about the difference of the game from his
mhm.
time to now. The rules have been changed, so you can't
Right.
run around like Robinson did. You can't hard slide anymore. Do you think that's taken something away from the game, or is it something good considering how
Well,
the
I
players
have
have
I
such
have a
high
friend.
salaries, they have to be
Yeah.
protected?
Well, I understand that, and all of that's true. I have a friend who played a couple of years of minor league baseball, a guy named Jerry Rosenthal from Hofstra. Was great shortstop. They moved him to second base in the minors, and he got taken out at second base by the guy sliding in from behind him. Took him out at the knees, and Jerry remembers the name of the guy, got his license plate and number and all of that. So, Jerry kind of feels like you should, but on the other hand, the hard-nosed way to play, which is what he learned and growing up in Brooklyn, and what we grew up watching, not just with Jackie Robinson, but and particularly I would add black players who came into baseball starting in 1947. My theory was, and it's backed up by talking to old timers, is that the black players were not, there was no commissioner of baseball in the Negro Leagues. I mean, there's the same kind of uniformity, and the ways to poach a game, to win a game, were vast and interesting. Guys were experimenting. They'd pull a hidden ball trick. They were stealing. They'd learn to steal. They'd learn to cheat a little bit off the base, or pitchers would learn to cheat throwing to first base. And they were more inventive because there was a certain desperation to their economic process, and to just the way they lived or tried to live in the America of the 40s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. So these guys came to baseball with a very imaginative, competitive streak to them, and it showed. I mean, Campanella was. I remember one time. I don't know if you remember Happy Felton's Knothole Gang. Happy Felton was this chubby guy who had a pregame show where he'd take a couple little kids and they would meet a ball player. So here's Roy Campanella, African American, part Italian, been a veteran of the Negro Leagues, now an MVP in the National League as a catcher for the Dodgers. And Happy Felton asked, or the kid asked the question, Mr. Campanella, how do you handle a rundown when a runner is coming down the base and you want to run him back to third and get him out? How do you handle that? And Campy, who had this high pitched voice, said, and I'm going to imitate him a little bit. Well, I'd say I just throw the ball right at his head, and you duck down and so on. So Campy's telling this like it's perfectly natural to throw the ball right between the runner's eyes, so he has to duck, and then you can tag him out. And Felton wanted none of that. He's Happy, are you telling the little campers here that you would throw a ball? And Campy was like, well, yeah, that's the way you play, with this high squeaky voice. You say, yeah, that's how you play the game. But I think you could broaden that and say that's how you did widen it on the field, that players were sliding hard, their spikes were up. Robinson ran into Davy Williams, the second baseman, I believe, for the Giants, the hated New York Giants. And Davy Williams was blocking the base. And I think it was second base. And really, Williams was never the same because he had this 220-pound or whatever Jackie was by that time rolling into him and knocked him out of the game and career. The next time the teams played, the Giants shortstop, Alvin Dark, great football player from LSU, white guy, obviously. I wouldn't say Alvin had any antipathy toward blacks, but he surely was a competitive guy, and that was his teammate. And Alvin came rolling into third base and knocked Jackie Robinson, halfway to the dugout. And Robinson just dusted himself off, and he knew that was the way it was played. He knew that whether he liked Dark or not, that Dark was going to do it, and probably in a broad sense had the right to do it. But that was the way that Robinson and a lot of other guys played. Frank Robinson coming along, no relation. Vada Pinson, some of those guys on the Cincinnati Reds. I make a point that there's almost a direct line of people that even if they didn't play in the Negro Leagues, they learned from the old timers, even back in their hometowns. And then Robinson and Pinson had this punk kid from Cincinnati on their team coming up in 1963 or 4, whatever it was, named Pete Rose. And Pete Rose was enough of a competitor anyway, but he had these two guys telling him, "Yeah, son, that's the way you play, son. You steal home, you slide hard, you take the extra base." And Rose, not that Rose really needed it, but he certainly had two teammates egging him on.
In the movie 42, there's a scene where the Montreal Royals are playing the Dodgers in a spring training game. Robinson he walks to first, steals second, steals third, and then he starts his dance, his spider
Right,
dance back and forth. And the
right.
pitcher yells at him, "Don't you?" And I don't know if this is true or not, because it's the movies.
It's a
Don't
movie,
you know
right,
to get back to third base? Because
right,
evidently they weren't used to seeing that kind of play.
right. I don't know that it happened. I suspect whether it did or didn't happen, there was enough inner feeling by what's this guy doing? That's not the way you play this game. Uh, and they had to adjust. So the pitchers would have to adjust. They would learn, the white pitchers in the so-called major leagues, they would learn to be a little quicker. And if you had to take your foot off the rubber a little bit quick and cheat a little bit and hope the umpire wouldn't catch you, you would do that. But certainly they learned to push the rules a little bit too. And I personally don't have any problem with that, because cheating in sport is not like cheating. Donald Trump sells apartment buildings that aren't worth anything. That's cheating. But somebody's edging off a base or learning how to do a phony um, anti-balk move. That's just sports cheating. That's a little bit different.
What can you tell us about the black players that joined the team while Robinson was there? What were the relationships between those players and Jackie?
Probably as varied as as all human beings are. I mean, there were a couple of guys earlier. There was a guy named Johnny Wright who never got it to I don't think he ever played in the major leagues, but he was around when Robinson came up. And then there was Dan Bankhead, who actually was a good hitting pitcher. I think he had a grand slam home run in the, I don't know, World Series or something like that. Didn't stay long. And then there was Roy Campanella, who was a get along kind of guy. Roy was a diplomat. He was older. He had two different cultures going around in him, and he was always more of a peacemaker, getting along with everybody. Having stories to tell. He would sit and talk to the writers in Vero Beach, Florida, and all of that. And then you had Don Newcomb, big tough guy out of New Jersey, who was a little bit raw, a little bit tough, and also, this is no secret, Nuke had a drinking problem and was pretty cranky guy sometimes, and also one of the best people I ever met. He sobered up, just a wonderful guy. I admire him so much. But sometimes Nuke could argue with Campanella, or he could argue with Robinson. He and Robinson could get into it. Robinson Jackie trying to calm him down a little bit. So you had all these. Then Joe Black, college guy out of I think Morgan State, or one of the historically black colleges. Joe Black coming along a couple of years later. So you had a number of different black players, and as varied as you and I and three other people.
Well, let's talk a bit about the process of doing this book. How were you approached? Were you invited to contribute? Did you learn about the project and said, "I want to contribute"? How did that work?
I'm not sure how Mike Long got in touch with me. I think we've known about each other for a while. He lives and works in the same area of Pennsylvania where we have some family. And I don't know if that, certainly we've talked about it, but I don't think that was necessarily part of it. He contacted me, maybe because I've written about Jackie Robinson in other books. I certainly wrote about the black influence and Musial. In the Musial book, I write about how Musial, more than his white teammates, while he certainly wasn't a crusader, he wanted to get along more than some of them did. And anyway, Mike contacted me, and I loved the idea. Did it as a labor of love, which I think he did also. And I didn't know who he was getting. I mean, you mentioned that people in the book are academics. but in fact, Howard Bryant and a
Right.
couple of other people are journalists, and some people go between the two. I mean, Gerald Early is as I understand it, is an academic, but he also writes in the popular press. So I don't think there's necessarily a hard line. I mean, Howard Bryant and I have been in a lot of press box together. He's done books on Hank Aaron and other people. So I don't think I don't think I'm the only one who's covered games. Maybe the number of them are going back a ways, but I think it's a varied thing. I was very proud to be in it. I didn't realize, but and you're right, there are a lot of academics in the book. I was pleased and surprised to read the complicated, learned point of view of some people in the book, many of the people in the book who had things to say from a sociological, political, academic point of view that I wouldn't necessarily, I might have it in me, but I wouldn't necessarily be thinking that way. That's not my main framework. So it's really, and there are some people who are very good at describing the way society was, what these people were up against, what Jackie Robinson was up against, what other people thought of him. It's a very learned crowd, and I'm happy to be along for the ride.
And that's, I think, what sets this book apart from previous books about Robinson. And there have been collections of essays about
Oh,
Robinson,
sure.
but this one certainly does take a look at his politics, at society, at the difficulties the African communities had, and still continues to have. And I think that that's a good service that this book does.
I mean, there are people in this book um, reading the normal book about Jackie Robinson or about baseball in the 40s and 50s. You wouldn't necessarily come across the tensions between, let's say, the Martin Luther King wing of emerging Black consciousness and the Malcolm X wing. If you could say that they were two different wings, which in a lot of ways they were. So Robinson had to work his way between them. And there's a great passage, and I think it's in the chapter by somebody named Yahuro Williams, who I don't know, but I believe he's a teacher academic, and he's writing about that Malcolm was on Jackie's butt somewhat about being a little bit more assertive, that not saying my country right or wrong. Robinson didn't necessarily believe in the demonstrate, taking the knee. The question is, what would Jackie Robinson think about taking the knee? And Williams in this chapter points out that at some point, now Malcolm, who was killed in 64, right after JFK was, right in the early 60s, that Malcolm had said to him, Jackie, at some point, you are going to change your mind, and you're going to realize that for you and for your children, that this is the way to be. You have to be more assertive. This country isn't necessarily doing us any favors with the way it's set up. And Robinson said, I now understand that Malcolm was exactly right. So I knew nothing about that dialogue or tension among those people, but as with anybody else, whatever race or politics, that there'll be differences of opinion, and certainly there were there.
I think again, that's one of the things that even someone like you, who's been involved in sports for decades, there's something to learn. There's still something to learn about Jackie Robinson. I think this is an important book, and it comes highly recommended. We've been talking with George Vecsey, who contributed an essay to 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy. George, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Hey man, thank you. It's always nice to be in touch with you.